A single dad, an old truck, a broken past. When Jake Carter, a small-town mechanic just trying to get through the week, agrees to fix a stranger's rusted-out pickup, he doesn't realize he's looking into the eyes of someone who once called this town home, a woman who vanished years ago, leaving behind only whispers and mystery. What he doesn't know. She's not just any drifter, she's the heir to one of the richest ranching families in the state. And she's come back to bury a legacy, not reclaim it. But life and love have other plans. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The whir of the socket wrench was the only sound left echoing in the dimly lit garage. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering like they were on their last legs, just like Jake Carter. He tightened the last bolt on a rusted-out Chevy, wiped his hands on a towel so stained it was more grime than fabric, and let out a tired breath that rattled somewhere deep in his chest, the kind of breath a man takes when he's held too much in for too long. The clock above the tool rack read 7:46 p.m. He was late. Again. Jake tossed the towel onto the workbench and grabbed his jacket. The winter air outside had turned sharp, cutting through his flannel shirt the second he stepped out. His pickup, old and dented, coughed to life after 2 tries. He didn't wince at the sound anymore. He couldn't afford to. By the time he pulled into the gravel drive of the tiny house he rented behind the diner, the porch light was already on. Lily had remembered, like she always did. Jake stepped inside and was greeted by the smell of mac and cheese from a box and the soft hum of cartoons coming from the living room. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, her plate resting on her knees, her dark hair tucked behind her ears the way her mother used to do. "You missed dinner," she said, not accusing, just stating the facts. Jake set down his keys and sat on the couch with a groan that made his bones creak. "Yeah, I know, sweetheart. Got stuck fixing Johnson's transmission. Again." Lily offered him the extra plate she'd kept warm in the oven. "I saved you the good part, the corner with the crispy cheese." He took it, smiling, though the weariness never left his eyes. "What would I do without you?" She shrugged, mouthful of macaroni. "Eat cereal." Again. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind only 2 people used to doing hard things can share. Jake glanced at the stack of unopened bills on the kitchen table. Rent was due next week. So was the electric. He'd already pushed the gas bill once. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. But for tonight, he had a warm plate, his daughter close by, and the fragile illusion that everything would somehow hold together for just a little longer. The bell above the garage door gave a tired jingle just as Jake was finishing his 3rd cup of coffee, bitter and lukewarm. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks of the building, dragging with it a fine layer of dust and the kind of cold that cut through denim like it was nothing. Jake looked up from the carburetor he'd been working on, wiping his hands as the rumble of an unfamiliar engine echoed through the shop. It was the kind of sound you didn't hear much anymore, throaty, uneven, like it was being held together by sheer willpower and rust. The truck crawled in, wheezing like it had just finished its last mile, and knew it. Its paint had once been green, maybe a forest shade, but time and neglect had stripped it down to patchy metal and dull streaks. The front grille hung slightly crooked, and the driver's side mirror looked like it had survived a war. The engine sputtered once, twice, then fell silent. Jake waited. Whoever was behind the wheel didn't move right away. Then the door creaked open, and she stepped out. Boots first, leather, scuffed, worn to the sole, then jeans, faded and stiff. Her coat was lined with dust, like she'd walked a long road without bothering to shake it off. And her eyes, they were the kind of eyes that had seen too much and didn't want to talk about it, cool, guarded, like a stranger in a place that used to be home. "Truck's overheating," she said, her voice low but steady. "Figured I'd limp it in before it gave out on the highway." Jake nodded, eyes scanning the vehicle. "You're lucky it made it this far. What year?" 1976, she replied. Sinclair C-20. Been in the family a while. Something about the way she said family made Jake pause. That name, Sinclair, hit a chord somewhere in his memory, but he let it slide. You passing through? He asked already, popping the hood. Something like that, she murmured, gaze lingering on the worn tools, the faded sign above the counter, the shop itself. Like she recognized it. Jake looked at her again. Really looked. And for a flicker of a second it felt like he should know who she was. But she wasn't offering answers. Not yet. Jake leaned under the hood, steam curling up around his hands as he checked the radiator hoses. The truck smelled like burnt oil and regret. Whatever history it carried, it was buried deep in the metal, layered in grime, fused with time. Behind him, the woman stood still, arms crossed, eyes following his every move, not suspicious, not impatient, just watching. He glanced over his shoulder. You got a name? A beat passed. Then she said, Sarah. Jake waited for more. It didn't come. No last name? She offered the faintest flicker of a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. Just Sarah? He nodded slowly, but the name didn't sit right. It was too clean, too vague, like a placeholder in a story she wasn't ready to tell. All right, just Sarah, he said, rising to wipe his hands. This truck of yours is running hot because your thermostat's stuck and your radiator's clogged with enough rust to weld a barn. You're lucky it didn't catch fire. She stepped closer, hand brushing the dusty fender with a kind of reverence. It's not mine, she said, quiet now. It belonged to someone I used to know. Jake studied her again. There was something about the way she said it, like the sentence carried more weight than it could hold, like it hurt to say out loud. Someone important? Her eyes flicked up to his, then away. Used to be. He nodded once, not pushing. He'd known that kind of silence before, the kind that builds walls brick by brick, day by day. You didn't tear it down with questions. You waited, gave it space. Well, he said, breaking the tension, if you want her roadworthy again, I'll need a day or two, maybe 3 if I have to order parts. She nodded, pulling a leather wallet from her coat. How much to start? Jake shook his head. Let's just get her breathing again. We'll talk cost when I know what we're dealing with. Sarah hesitated, then tucked the wallet back in. Thanks. Her voice cracked, just slightly. Jake turned back to the truck, pretending not to notice. Some stories came in slow. This one, he sensed, would come in pieces. Jake didn't have time for mysteries, not these days. The shop was already running 2 days behind. The parts delivery was late again, and one of the lifts had started groaning like it was ready to give up the ghost. He had 3 cars lined up, all waiting on someone else's schedule. He didn't need another project, especially not one wrapped in flannel and secrets. He leaned on the edge of the workbench, eyeing Sarah through the haze of steam, still drifting from the old truck's engine. She stood near the entrance, not pacing, not pleading, just waiting, like she'd already accepted the answer before it came. I'm full up, he said, keeping his voice even. Short-staffed, low on parts. I can't promise anything quick. She didn't flinch, just nodded once, slow and quiet. I understand. Jake rubbed the back of his neck. Most people would argue, bargain, try to win him over with urgency or charm. She didn't. She simply turned back toward the driver's side door like she'd start walking before the truck could cool, and that is what got him. The way she moved, heavy but calm, like she'd been carrying disappointment a long time and wasn't surprised to feel its weight again, like she'd heard no before and had learned not to ask twice. Wait, he called out before he could think better of it. She stopped mid-step. He sighed, shoulders sagging under the weight of his own exhaustion. Leave it. I'll take a look when I can. She turned, the barest thread of relief passing over her face, but it vanished just as quick. Thank you, she said. Jake didn't respond. Instead, he walked over to the truck, popped the hood again, and tried to convince himself this wasn't a mistake. He didn't have time for broken things, but somehow he'd said yes to fixing one more. Maybe because the truck reminded him of his own. Maybe because she reminded him of someone else. someone who used to carry silence the same way. Or maybe because deep down, Jake Carter was still the kind of man who couldn't walk away when someone had nothing left to ask. Jake was elbow deep in the engine bay when he heard the screen door creak open from the side of the garage. Light footsteps padded across the concrete, quick and certain. He didn't need to look up. Lily had a way of entering a room like she owned it, head held high, eyes scanning every corner like a detective in sneakers. "Dad?" she called, hopping up on the step stool by the toolbox. "Is that truck out front a 76 Sinclair? Because it looks like one." Jake smirked without turning around. "You've been reading those old car manuals again, haven't you?" "Just the ones with the cool pictures," she said with a shrug. "Whose is it?" Before he could answer, the woman stepped around the corner. Sarah, quiet, still holding herself, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to exist in the space. Her coat was dusted with road and time, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense braid. She looked like she hadn't smiled in a while, or maybe she'd forgotten how. Lily's eyes locked on her immediately. Sarah gave a small nod. "Hey there." "You the truck lady?" Lily asked, unabashed. Jake shot her a look, but she kept going. "My dad says she's a rust bucket, but I think she's kind of cool." Sarah let out a soft laugh, unexpected, light. "She's definitely got character." Lily jumped off the stool and walked right up to her. "I'm Lily." "Sarah," she replied. For a moment they just stood there. Jake wiped his hands and watched from the side, waiting for the awkward silence that usually came when strangers met his daughter. But Lily surprised him. "You look familiar," she said, cocking her head. "Like someone I saw in a photo once. Do you live around here?" Sarah hesitated, something flickering across her face. A brief panic, maybe, but it passed. "Not anymore." Lily didn't press, just nodded, accepting the answer as it was. "Well, if you're going to be around while Dad fixes your truck, you can sit with me. I've got fruit snacks." Jake raised a brow, but Sarah just smiled, a real one this time. "Thanks. I might take you up on that." And just like that, the guarded woman and the bold little girl sat down on the old bench by the heater, sharing silence and fruit snacks, like old friends. Jake didn't know what Sarah was running from, but he could see it plain as day. Lily saw something in her, something familiar. And Lily had never been wrong about people. Jake was under the truck again the next morning, flashlight clenched between his teeth, muttering to himself about seized bolts and corroded brackets. The Sinclair might have been a classic, but time hadn't been kind. Everything underneath was coated in a thick film of dried mud, grease, and memory. He scraped gently at the undercarriage, trying not to shear anything off that he couldn't replace. When he moved to check the rear differential, something caught his eye near the bumper. A faint glint of metal beneath layers of grime. At first he thought it was just a rusted bolt, but as he wiped at it with the edge of his rag, letters started to emerge. His brows pulled together. The plate had been tucked up under the bumper like someone had hidden it, or maybe just stopped caring it was there. He scrubbed a little harder, then sat back on his heels. M. Grace. He stared at it for a beat too long. Grace. The name stirred something, a memory, one he hadn't thought about in years. Margaret Grace Sinclair, he murmured, the name falling from his lips before he even realized he was saying it. The Sinclair family used to be something of a legend around here. Biggest ranch in the county, land that stretched for miles. Everyone knew about them. Everyone knew about the accident. And everyone remembered the girl who disappeared not long after the funeral, barely 18. No note, no trace. He stood slowly, brushing his hands on his jeans, eyes narrowing as he looked toward the shop's side room. Sarah was there, talking to Lily again, laughing at something his daughter had said. The resemblance was too far a stretch to claim anything for certain. Time had a way of changing a face. And yet, there was something, a tilt of the chin, the shape of the eyes. Jake turned back to the plate. He frowned hard. Couldn't be. Margaret Grace had vanished 10 years ago. The girl everyone whispered about, The girl who walked away from a fortune and never looked back. He shook his head. It was a coincidence. Had to be. Still, when he walked back into the garage, he slipped the plate into his toolbox without a word. Some part of him knew this wasn't just a truck, and she wasn't just Sarah. The sky was bleeding into dusk as Jake rumbled down the old county road, his truck's headlights flickering on against the creeping blue. He hadn't meant to take the long way home, but something about the day had left him restless. He needed air, space, a break from the weight that had settled in his chest ever since he found that plate tucked beneath Sarah's bumper. He took the turn almost without thinking, tires crunching on gravel as he veered off the main strip and onto the path that hadn't seen traffic in years. The fields on either side were bare now, winter stripping everything down to bones. And then, through the thinning trees, it came into view. The Sinclair ranch. The house stood like a skeleton at the edge of the horizon, wood faded to gray, shutters hanging crooked, the wraparound porch sagging with time. The barn was worse, half collapsed on one side, its roof caved in like the place had finally given up trying to hold itself together. Jake eased his truck to a stop by the rusted gate. Grass had grown wild through the slats, tangling around the chains that once kept visitors out. Now, there was nothing to keep out, nothing left to guard. He hadn't been out here since the funeral. No one really had. He stepped out, boots crunching in the silence, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets as the wind pulled at his collar. The house had always been beautiful once, white clapboard, green shutters, the smell of horses and wildflowers. It used to be alive, full of cookouts, music, people, laughter. Then the accident happened, a car crash upstate. Both parents gone in a blink, and Margaret Grace, just a kid, vanished days after. Some said she ran away. Others said she cracked under the weight of the grief. A few believed darker things, whispered behind closed doors, but no one ever found her. Not a letter, not a goodbye. Just gone. Jake leaned against the fence, staring at the broken windows, the silence pressing in. And for the first time, he wondered, if she had come back, would this be the first place she'd go? Would she even be able to face it? He watched the house a moment longer, then turned and climbed back into his truck. But he didn't drive away just yet. Instead, he sat in the quiet, staring through the windshield at the shadows, a name circling in his mind like a ghost. Margaret Grace Sinclair. No. He shook his head. It couldn't be her. Could it? Saturday morning rolled in with a gray sky and the kind of chill that stuck to your bones. Jake had opened the garage early, hoping to get ahead of a backed-up schedule, but his thoughts kept drifting. Sarah had dropped by again, this time carrying coffee and a quiet calm like it belonged to her. She didn't talk much, never did, but she stayed longer each time, sat near Lily while she drew or wandered the lot, watching the horizon like she expected something or someone to show up. By mid-morning, Jake was under the Sinclair again, knuckles raw, trying to coax the stubborn exhaust manifold free when he heard Lily's voice drift in from outside. She knew about the path behind Miller's Pond. He paused, listening. She told me it leads to the old train trestle, where the wild blackberries grow. How'd she know that, Dad? Jake slid out from beneath the truck, wiping his hands, and leaned just far enough to glance out the bay doors. Lily was crouched beside Sarah near the gravel lot, tossing pebbles at a tin can. Sarah wasn't looking at her, just smiling faintly, eyes focused on some fixed point in the distance. Jake stepped out into the cold. That's a pretty hidden trail, kiddo. Most people don't even know it's there. That's what I said, Lily replied, glancing up at him. But she didn't even ask, just walked straight through the brush, like she'd done it 100 times. Sarah didn't respond. She reached down and flicked a pebble toward the can. It bounced off with a clink. Jake studied her. You been in these parts before? She finally looked up at him, and for a second, just one, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear, not guilt, just memory, deep and buried and too close to touch. Long time ago, she said. Lily grinned like she'd figured out a riddle. Told you, ghosts don't wear boots. Jake raised an eyebrow. Ghosts? She walks like she's from here, Lily said, matter of fact. Knows stuff only locals know. But she talks like she forgot how to belong. Sarah stood, brushing dust from her jeans. Some places leave a mark, that's all. Jake wanted to press further. He could feel the truth hanging just beneath her skin. But the wind kicked up, and Sarah turned toward it like she'd heard something calling. Ghosts didn't wear boots, but maybe they came back wearing names that weren't theirs. The night came down heavier than usual, pressing low over the garage roof as wind slid through the trees like it carried secrets. Jake had stayed late again, trying to make sense of a leaky fuel line on a Chevy that didn't want saving. Most of the other shops had already gone dark, but he kept the lights on, same as always, part habit, part fear of stopping. Sarah was still there. She hadn't said much since dinner, just sat on the bench outside the shop with Lily's sketchpad in her lap, flipping through pages of crude horses and lightning bolts drawn in crayon. She'd smiled once, soft and sad, at a picture Lily had labeled Home. It showed their little house with smoke curling from the chimney, and Jake's beat-up truck parked in front. Jake finally wiped the grease from his hands and stepped outside, his breath clouding in the cold. "You always stick around this late?" he asked. Sarah glanced up at him, tucking the sketchpad under her arm. "Only when it's warmer here than wherever else I could go." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "That's supposed to be a joke?" "Maybe." She hesitated. "Maybe not." He watched her for a long moment, then said carefully, "You don't talk much about where you're from." She shrugged, pulling her jacket tighter. "Not much worth talking about." "Lily says you walk like someone who's been here before." Sarah smiled faintly, but it didn't hold. "I used to know this town, a long time ago." Jake didn't blink. "You from around here?" Her eyes flicked to his, then dropped. "I was, sort of. We left when I was young." That was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. He could hear it in the way her voice dipped, like she was standing too close to a cliff of memory and afraid one more word might make her fall in. Jake nodded slowly, pretending to let it go. "Well, wherever you're from, you're here now." "Yeah," she said, eyes distant. "I guess I am." But the way she said it, he knew she hadn't come back just for a broken truck. Something had pulled her here, something she hadn't named. Not yet. Jake had seen a lot of trucks in his day, busted-up workhorses, rusted-out relics, and the occasional rebuild some guy poured his retirement into. But Sarah's Sinclair, it didn't fit the usual mold. It looked like a rust bucket from the outside, sure, paint chipped to bare metal, upholstery torn at the seams, dashboard cracked from too many summers in the sun, but under the hood? That was something else entirely. He ran a clean rag over the valve cover, the engraved lettering catching the shop light just enough to gleam, not standard, not factory, custom. The fuel injection system was aftermarket top-grade stuff, precision-built and expensive. The timing chain had been replaced recently. Suspension parts looked nearly new. Even the wiring had been redone with care, not the slapdash kind of work most folks did to get by. Whoever had maintained this truck knew exactly what they were doing, and hadn't spared the money to do it right. Jake stepped back and exhaled through his nose, a frown settling deep into his face. None of it added up. The woman barely spoke about herself, paid in cash, kept her distance like she was afraid of being recognized. And yet this truck had been cared for like it was a legacy. He checked the serial plate again. Original body, original engine. A76 Sinclair C20, like she said. But the upgrades, those weren't backyard fixes. They were investments. He stared at the truck for a long while, thumb rubbing absently against the edge of a wrench. This wasn't just a vehicle. This was a story. A buried one. He turned to the workbench and pulled open the drawer where he'd tucked the plate, M. Grace. The metal was still cold, still quiet, but it spoke louder than anything Sarah had told him. Whoever she was, she hadn't just found this truck on the side of the road. She'd loved it, or someone she loved had. Jake looked out through the garage window, catching sight of her across the lot. She was sitting on the bench again, jacket zipped high, eyes locked on the horizon, like she was waiting for the past to arrive. That truck wasn't just old. It was built to carry weight no ordinary vehicle could hold. Memories, regret, maybe even redemption. The wind had picked up fast, the way it always did out here, sudden and wild, like the land remembered how to be angry. Jake stood in the doorway of the shop, staring out at the horizon where black clouds were piling thick and low, crawling toward town like a slow-brewing threat. The air had turned heavy, electric, the kind of weight you feel in your teeth before the rain even starts. He didn't have time to shut down properly, but he knew the drill. The last time a storm like this hit, it peeled the corner of the roof clean off and flooded half the tool room. Jake moved fast, pulling in the rolling racks, locking down the lifts, cursing under his breath as the wind started to howl through the bay doors. Sarah appeared at his side without a word. No questions, no hesitation. Just grabbed a hammer and started nailing the boards he handed her across the windows. Lily was inside already, setting out the lanterns like it was a routine, which, in their world, it was. Jake spared a glance at Sarah as they worked, rain starting to tap against the roof in hard, scattered drops. Her braid had come loose in the wind, strands whipping across her cheek. But she didn't flinch. She just kept hammering, her jaw set, eyes steady. "You ever done this before?" he asked, nodding toward the final board. Sarah nailed it into place with a practiced rhythm. "Yeah," she said, brushing hair out of her face. "More times than I care to count." The sky cracked open as the last board went up, lightning splitting the clouds above them. The rain came next, fast and furious, slamming against the tin roof like fists on a door. Jake shut the main bay, locking it tight as thunder rolled in behind them. Inside it felt like a different world. The lights flickered, the power threatening to cut out, but for now it held. Lily sat cross-legged on a blanket with a book, calm as ever. Jake and Sarah stood near the window, watching the storm claw at the trees. "Funny," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the roar outside. "You never forget this kind of rain." Jake glanced over at her. "This storm, or the one that brought you back?" She didn't answer, just stared out at the sky, eyes glassy, but she stayed beside him, and for once didn't run from the silence. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, but the sky remained bruised with clouds, low and unsettled. The garage was quiet the next morning, the world outside still dripping from the storm's aftermath. Jake moved through the shop with sluggish purpose, checking for damage. A few leaks, nothing new. A downed branch across the drive. Manageable. Lily was already awake, bundled in her oversized hoodie, hair a tangled mess from sleep. She'd brought a flashlight and a mission, exploring the Sinclair truck while Jake worked. He didn't think much of it. She'd always been curious, always had a knack for finding the things adults forgot to notice. He was under the hood again when he heard her call out, "Dad, there's something in here." Jake wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. Lily stood on the passenger side of the truck, glove box open, papers scattered across the cracked vinyl seat. Insurance slips, faded maps, an old tin of peppermints. But it was the photograph in her hand that made Jake stop short. She held it like it was glass. The photo was old, black and white, the corners curled from time and heat. It showed a young girl, barely 16 maybe, perched atop a tall, lean horse. Behind her was the unmistakable outline of the Sinclair ranch house, still whole in the picture. Her hair was down, long and dark, and she wore a crooked grin like she hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the world. Jake took the photo, turning it slowly in his hands. It was Sarah. He knew it now, no question. Younger, sure, softer. But the shape of her smile, the set of her jaw, it was her. And she wasn't just posing with any horse. That was Red, the stallion old man Sinclair used to parade around at every county fair, the one no one else could ride. Jake looked at Lily. "Where'd you find this?" "Glove box. It fell out when I opened it," she said. "Is that her?" He didn't answer. He walked out to the lot, heart pounding, the photo clenched tight in his hand. Sarah was leaning against the porch post, coffee in hand, staring at the horizon again. He stopped a few feet from her, lifted the picture. "Want to tell me how this ended up in your glove box?" She froze, her face paling as her eyes locked on the photo. Her silence told him everything. And somehow it was louder than any answer she could have given. Jake stood in the shop long after Sarah disappeared into the storm-gray morning. The photo still sat on the workbench, its curled edges trembling under the low hum of the space heater. He couldn't take his eyes off it. That crooked grin, that horse, that house. It wasn't a guess anymore. Wasn't a hunch or some ghost stirred up by coincidence. Sarah was Margaret Grace Sinclair, the missing girl who'd vanished after the funeral, leaving behind a legacy of money, land, and silence. People had searched. Reporters had swarmed, but no one ever found her, not in the papers, not in nearby cities, not even in whispered phone calls to relatives who might have known where she went. It was like she'd evaporated. Until now. Jake leaned on the bench, arms braced, breath heavy. His mind was racing, trying to catch up with the facts his gut had already accepted. Why the lies? Why hide who she was? Why show up with no last name, no answers, just a truck filled with secrets and eyes that looked like they'd seen the whole world burn? He remembered what the town used to say about the Sinclairs: rich, untouchable, too proud for their own good. But he also remembered the day the news came. Margaret's parents killed in a car crash outside Amarillo. A slick highway, a bend in the road, and everything they'd built crumpled in a heartbeat. The funeral was closed casket. The girl didn't speak. And then one morning she was just gone. Jake had been younger then, just a mechanic in the back of Crawford's Shell station. But even back then he'd known that kind of grief could swallow a person whole. He looked out the window now, catching a glimpse of Sarah, Margaret, walking slowly toward the truck, arms crossed tight, her face unreadable. She didn't look like someone who'd come home. She looked like someone walking through a battlefield made of memories. He didn't confront her again. Not yet. There was something about the way she moved, cautious and measured, like a deer that hadn't decided whether to run or not. She had returned to the town that forgot her, but she hadn't come back to be seen. Jake just didn't know whether she was here to bury the past or dig it up. By Monday, the wind had changed. Not the weather, it was still bitter and dry, same as always. But something in the way people looked at Jake when he walked into the diner made his stomach twist. He'd barely crossed the threshold before Martha, who'd been slinging coffee there since before he could drive, froze mid-pour and narrowed her eyes like she was trying to place him in a puzzle she didn't know she was solving. "You've got company helping at the garage now?" she asked, voice sharp as the edge of a pie knife. Jake sat at the counter, nodding slowly. "Someone passing through, named Sarah." Martha set the coffee pot down with a soft clink, too gentle to be casual. "Funny. Ruth Carter swore she saw Margaret Grace Sinclair at Pump 4 yesterday afternoon. Said she nearly dropped her bagel." Jake didn't respond right away, just wrapped his fingers around the ceramic mug and let the silence stretch. The diner, once full of idle clatter, seemed to quiet around them. Even the old jukebox in the corner played a little softer. "She mistaken?" Martha prodded. Jake looked up, met her eyes. Wouldn't know. That was enough to confirm it wasn't just rumor. It was fuel. And in a town like theirs, fuel didn't stay bottled long. By the time he got back to the garage, 3 texts had come in. Don from the hardware store, asking if it was true. Eric Jensen, nosy as ever, wanting to know if she was back for good. Even Sheriff Dalton had left a message. Just saw her walking down Main. "You got any idea what she's doing here?" Jake stood outside the shop, staring down Main Street as the questions rolled in like thunder. Sarah, Margaret, had gone to the diner that morning, alone. She hadn't said a word about it. Maybe she was tired of hiding. Maybe she wanted the town to know, but now it was out. He saw her walking back down the sidewalk, head low, boots hitting the pavement with a rhythm that didn't quite match the calm on her face. Her coat flapped in the wind, hair loose, eyes flicking side to side as people turned to look. Some recognized her instantly. Others just stared like they were looking at a ghost that had the nerve to come back with flesh and bone. Jake met her at the edge of the lot. She stopped a foot away, eyes unreadable. "They know," she said simply. He nodded. "Yeah, they do." And for the first time, she didn't look like she wanted to run. She just looked tired. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, like the sky hadn't finished grieving yet. Jake stood in the back of the garage, hands black with grease, pretending to focus on the carburetor spread out in pieces on the bench. But his mind wasn't in it. Not really. Not since Sarah walked in that morning with a silence thicker than usual and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept all night. She hovered near the office door for a while, arms crossed like she was holding herself together by the seams. Finally, she spoke. "I need to talk to you." Jake wiped his hands on a towel and nodded toward the folding chair near the wall. "I figured." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the space heater in the corner. Sarah stared down at her hands, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "My parents left the farm to me," she said. No build-up, no hesitation, just the truth, dropped like a stone in a still pond. Jake blinked. "You mean, in their will?" she cut in. "After the accident?" "Everything went to me, the land, the house, even the debts." He sat back as, letting the weight of it settle between them. "I didn't know what to do," she continued. "I was 18. One minute they were alive, arguing over dinner, and the next, I was picking out caskets and signing paperwork I couldn't understand." She swallowed hard, eyes shining but not spilling over. "Everyone kept saying how strong I was, how proud they'd be, but I wasn't strong. I couldn't breathe in that house. Every corner felt like them, every photo, every room, like they'd walk in at any second, so I left." Jake nodded slowly, careful not to interrupt. "I went east, changed my name, started over. I told myself it was just for a little while until the grief passed, but it never did." She looked up at him then, voice trembling. "I came back to sell it, quietly. No attention, no headlines. Just make it disappear." Jake exhaled. "And now?" Sarah looked away toward the old truck parked near the bay doors. Her voice came softer this time, almost a whisper. "Now I'm not so sure I can let it go." For the first time since she walked into his life, Jake saw her not as a mystery or a memory, but as someone still trying to crawl out of the wreckage of who she used to be, and maybe, just maybe, trying to decide if she wanted to be found. Jake didn't say much after Sarah left the garage that night. She'd told her truth, dropped it like a rusted wrench on the floor, and walked away as if the sound it made wasn't deafening. She didn't wait for a reaction. Maybe she didn't want one. Maybe she was used to walking out before things got too real. But Jake couldn't move past it. Not this time. He stayed late again, but the work in front of him went untouched. The open hood of the Sinclair truck stared back at him, and all he could see was everything she hadn't said. Every moment they'd shared. Quiet coffees, Lily's laughter, her helping board up the shop before the storm. It all felt like it had been built on sand. He slammed a wrench down on the bench, the sound cracking through the quiet like thunder. A sharp curse slipped out as metal bounced, echoed, then fell still. She had sat at his table, held his daughter's hand, let Lily draw her into pictures labeled home, and all the while she knew who she was, knew what she was planning, knew she was going to walk away. He had trusted her. Jake Carter didn't trust easy, not after everything he'd lost, but he'd let her in, piece by piece. He'd looked past the guarded stares and the evasive answers. He'd told himself she was just trying to heal, like so many others who came through town carrying too much. But this wasn't a stranger with ghosts. This was Margaret Grace Sinclair, heir to the biggest stretch of land this town had ever seen, and she hadn't told him the truth until she was backed into a corner. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the garage floor like it might burn under his boots. The worst part wasn't the lie. It was how much he'd let her matter. And now? Now he didn't know if any of it had meant to her what it had meant to him. Outside, the wind picked up again, cold and sharp. Somewhere in the dark, her truck sat like a monument to every damn thing she'd hidden. Jake stared at it, jaw clenched. He didn't know what hurt more, the lie or the fact that, even now, part of him still wanted her to walk back through the door. The morning after felt colder than it should have. Not the weather, though frost clung to the edges of the windows, but in the way the house felt when Jake stepped into the kitchen. Lily was already up, her cereal untouched, spoon resting in the bowl like she'd forgotten it halfway through a thought. Jake poured himself coffee, the silence between them stretching tight. She didn't ask where Sarah was, didn't mention her name, but he knew she was thinking it. After a few minutes, Lily pushed her chair back, went to the hall drawer, and pulled out paper and markers. She didn't say what she was doing, just sat cross-legged on the floor, brows furrowed, tongue poking out the side of her mouth like she did when she was deep in it. Jake watched for a while, pretending to focus on the paper in front of him, bills spread out like a battlefield, but his eyes kept drifting to her. Finally, she folded the page carefully, tucked it into an envelope, and stood. "I want to give this to Sarah," she said. Jake blinked. "Lily." "I know she lied." Her voice was calm, clear, too clear for a 10-year-old. "But she didn't lie to me, not really." He looked at her, heart aching in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't honest about who she was. She was honest about how she felt, Lily said. That matters too. Jake didn't answer, didn't know how to. Lily walked over, handed him the envelope. "Can you give it to her?" He hesitated, then nodded. "What does it say?" She offered a soft smile, shy and small. "Just the truth." Later that afternoon, when Jake finally walked out to Sarah's truck, still parked beside the garage like it was waiting for permission to leave, he opened the door and placed the envelope on the driver's seat. On the front, in Lily's neat, slanted handwriting, it said, "For Sarah, even if that's not your real name." Inside, the note read, "You don't have to be someone else to be kind, and even if you're not who you said you were still kind to me. That means more." Jake stood there for a long time, staring at the paper. Then he shut the door, stepped back, and let the wind carry whatever came next. Jake was closing up for the night when he saw her. Sarah stood at the edge of the gravel lot, hands buried deep in the pockets of her coat, eyes fixed on the ground like she was rehearsing something. The porch light cast a faint glow around her, catching the edges of her hair and the lines of her face that looked sharper now, like the days were wearing her thinner. He didn't speak, just waited. She walked toward him slowly, like every step cost her something. When she finally stopped in front of him, she didn't meet his eyes. "I got your daughter's letter," she said quietly. Tell her it meant more than she'll ever know." Jake nodded once, stiff. He didn't know what to say to her anymore. Everything between them felt too raw, too uncertain. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in a faded scrap of cloth. When she unwrapped it, the light caught a brass key, old, tarnished, heavy with time. "I want you to come with me," she said, holding it out, "to the house." Jake stared at it, unmoving. "I don't want to go back in alone," she added. He didn't take the key right away. Instead, he looked at her, really looked. Her shoulders were hunched, her voice barely steady, and in her eyes for the first time wasn't defiance or distance. It was fear. "Why now?" he asked. "Because I thought I could walk away," she said, her words low. "Sell it, close the door, pretend none of it mattered anymore." "But it does. And I think I need to see it again to understand why I left." Jake slowly reached out and took the key, its weight settling in his palm like it had been waiting for him all along. When? She glanced up at him. Tomorrow, early, before the town starts whispering again. He nodded. As she turned to leave, he looked down at the key, smooth in places, jagged in others, a piece of the past, handed over not with apology, but with quiet hope. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something close. The old Sinclair house groaned when Jake turned the key. The door resisted for a moment, swollen with years of silence, then gave way with a long, reluctant creak. Morning light filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the warped floorboards. The smell hit him first, old wood, forgotten rain, something faintly floral buried deep beneath the decay, a scent that hadn't quite died. Sarah didn't step in right away. She stood at the threshold like the house itself might swallow her whole. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling despite the warmth of the morning sun. Jake waited, letting her choose the moment. When she finally crossed into the hallway, it was like watching someone walk back into a memory they swore they'd buried. The place was frozen. A coat still hung by the door. A porcelain lamp on the side table leaned at the same angle he remembered from years ago, when folks still came out here for barn dances and summer barbecues. Time hadn't taken the house. It had just paused, like it was waiting for her to come back and press play. They moved slowly through the rooms, each one echoing with things unsaid. In the dining room, the table was still set for 6, plates covered in dust, silverware tarnished but perfectly arranged. A half-used candle had melted into a warped puddle on a floral runner. It was like someone had expected dinner to happen again. Sarah paused in front of the fireplace, her fingers brushing the edge of a framed photo on the mantel. Her parents, her, younger, softer, still whole. She sank to the floor without a word. Jake knelt beside her, unsure whether to reach out or stay still. They were fighting that night, she whispered, eyes locked on the floor. Mom wanted to sell the land. Dad said over his dead body. Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward. And then they were gone. I blamed myself. I still do. Jake sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder. You were a kid, Sarah. I told them to leave. I slammed the door. Told them I wished they'd never come back. Her chest heaved, and for the first time the tears came. Not loud, not theatrical, just steady, relentless. It's not about the house, she said through the sobs. It's not about the money. It never was. Jake didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just sat there, grounded and solid, as she came apart beside the only place left that remembered her before the world fell apart. The barn was worse off than the house. Time had done its work here, wood sagging under its own weight, rust dripping from old nails, shingles long since surrendered to wind and weather. Jake pushed the heavy doors open with a grunt, the hinges screaming in protest. Dust billowed around him, thick enough to sting his throat. Sarah lingered at the threshold, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the shadows like she wasn't sure which ghost still lived here. Jake moved carefully through the wreckage, broken tools, shattered glass jars, hay long turned to mulch. Everything felt abandoned, but not forgotten. He stepped around a collapsed workbench where a few old feed bags sat slumped in the corner. Something about the shape behind them caught his eye. He cleared the bags and found a wooden chest. Simple, sturdy, the kind you don't build unless you intend for it to last. The lock had rusted off years ago. When he opened it, the hinges let out a dry, breathless sigh. Inside were ledgers, dozens of them. Jake flipped one open, brushing the dust aside. The handwriting was neat, detailed, familiar. Donations, every line item cataloged, groceries delivered to the town pantry, repairs funded anonymously for the school's roof, supplies sent to the church kitchen, monthly, consistent, quiet. He flipped to the back and found a note, scrawled in the same pen. They don't need to know it's me. Let them think it's luck. W.S. Jake stared at the name. Walter Sinclair, Sarah's father. He turned slowly, heart thudding as he looked back toward her, She hadn't moved. "Your dad," Jake said, voice low, reverent. "He was helping everyone, for years, without credit, without anyone knowing." She stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" He held out the ledger. When she took it and read, her breath hitched. She flipped page after page, her hands trembling. "I thought he only cared about the land," she whispered. "I thought he was too proud to see beyond it." Jake shook his head. He saw everything. He just didn't want applause. Sarah sank onto a nearby bale of hay, the ledger resting open on her lap like it had weight she'd never expected to carry. "He wasn't the man I thought he was," she said softly. Jake crouched beside her, eyes locked on hers. "Maybe none of us are. Not until the right eyes are looking." In the quiet that followed, the barn didn't feel broken anymore. It felt sacred. The black SUV kicked up a cloud of dust as it rolled down the dirt road, its sleek frame gleaming like an insult against the dull winter sky. Jake watched it approach from the barn window, the low rumble of its engine louder than it had any right to be in a place like this. Sarah stood beside him, arms folded tight, jaw set like concrete. She already knew who it was. So did he. The vehicle came to a stop just outside the old farmhouse. Doors opened in unison. 2 men in suits stepped out, one older, one younger, both looking too clean for this much dirt. The older man adjusted his tie and looked around like the land offended him. "Miss Sinclair," he called out, spotting her immediately. "Pleasure to finally meet you in person." Sarah didn't move. Jake stepped out first, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes hard. "You lost?" The man smiled thinly. "Not at all. I'm Garrett Ellison, managing partner at Redwood Development. This is my associate, Thomas. We've been in talks with Miss Sinclair's attorney regarding the property." Sarah came down the porch steps slowly. She didn't offer her hand. "I haven't signed anything," she said. "Not yet," Garrett replied smoothly. "But we're ready when you are. Full cash offer. You won't even have to come back here again." Jake scoffed. "That's the whole plan, isn't it? Wipe it clean, pave it over." The younger man opened a folder, sliding out aerial renderings, gleaming buildings, asphalt lots, a planned community center with smiling families sketched into the mock-ups. It looked like something from another planet. Garrett tapped the papers. "This could be something real. Jobs, growth. This town's dying, you know that." Sarah looked down at the images, then back toward the barn where her father's ledgers still sat open, proof of a legacy no blueprint could replicate. "And what happens to the house?" she asked. "Demolished. Doesn't meet code," Garrett replied. "It's just lumber and memories." Sarah's eyes darkened. Jake stepped closer, voice low but firm. "You should go." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "We'll be back. Time's ticking." As the SUV disappeared down the road, Sarah stayed rooted where she stood, hands clenched, the wind tugging at her coat. "I was going to sell it," she whispered. Jake didn't look at her. "Were?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah, were." Sarah stood in the middle of the field as the wind pulled at her coat and the sky pressed low with a weight that felt familiar. The earth here still remembered her. The barn behind her creaked with each gust, and the farmhouse windows, streaked with age, caught the light like eyes watching her. The Sinclair land stretched in every direction, quiet and stubborn, refusing to forget the name it had carried for generations. But Sarah didn't know if she was strong enough to carry it. She held the offer in her hands, a formal contract, thick with clauses and fine print, signed by men who spoke in profits and projections. A number at the bottom was circled, bold, and impossible to ignore. It was enough to make anyone walk away. Enough to buy a new life somewhere far from the whispers, far from the weight of everything she'd tried to bury. She could be gone by the end of the week. She could disappear again. No forwarding address, no long goodbyes. But then her eyes drifted toward the barn, where Jake had spent the morning repairing the door like it still mattered, where Lily had chased a stray cat through the hayloft and named it Clover, where the ledgers still sat on the workbench, pages open, Proof of a man who never needed recognition to do right by his town. Sarah blinked hard. It wasn't just the buildings. It wasn't even the land. It was the people, her father's quiet generosity, the way Jake looked at her like she wasn't broken, the way Lily held her hand without question. It was the stories buried in these fences, the ghosts that hadn't chased her off but had waited, year after year, for her to come home and listen. But what if she failed? What if she poured everything she had into restoring this place and still couldn't make it mean something? The papers fluttered in her grip. Escape was clean. Legacy was hard. She looked toward the house, weathered, patient, waiting. And for the first time, Sarah didn't feel trapped by it. She felt called. Jake found her at the edge of the pasture, arms folded tight, staring at the old windmill as it creaked in the wind like it was still trying to turn time backward. The grass crunched under his boots as he walked up beside her. She didn't look at him, didn't speak, but he could feel the tension radiating off her in waves. "I saw the contract," he said, voice low. "The one Garrett left on the porch." Sarah's jaw tensed. "I haven't signed it." "Not yet," he replied carefully. "But you're thinking about it?" She didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, brittle and tight. Jake took a breath. "You don't have to do this alone." At that she turned, eyebrows raised. "And what exactly would that look like?" He didn't flinch. "We fix it up. The house, the barn, the fences. We get the land breathing again." She let out a bitter laugh. "With what? Hope and elbow grease? It's falling apart." Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, it is. But it's still standing. Just like you." Her mouth pressed into a line, but she didn't walk away. "This land meant something once," he continued. "Your dad, he knew that. He took care of people in ways nobody ever saw. That ledger in the barn, that's not just numbers, that's legacy." She looked down at her boots, voice quieter now. "I'm not him." "No," Jake said. "You're not? But you've got his heart, whether you want to admit it or not." She blinked fast, eyes stinging. Jake stepped closer. "This town's got enough ghosts. What it needs is someone brave enough to stay, start fresh, show people what this place still has to give." She met his eyes, then really met them, and in hers he saw the fear. But he also saw the flicker of something else, hope, maybe, or maybe the memory of it. "I've got tools," he said, "hands that know how to work, and a daughter who already thinks this is home." She swallowed hard. "Why are you doing this?" Jake shrugged, looking back at the land. "Because I believe in things that take time, and you're one of them." He held out his hand. No promises, no pressure, just a choice. Sarah stared at it for a long moment, then reached out and took it. The sun was low when Sarah found herself back in the attic. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling around her like memory itself had weight. She hadn't been up here in years, not since the day after the funeral, when she'd packed a duffel bag and walked out with nothing but her name and the unbearable ache in her chest. Boxes were stacked in uneven towers, some still sealed, others gaping open, like wounds. She pulled one closer and opened the lid. Inside, old photographs, birthday cards, receipts, handwritten notes from her mother, all in looping cursive. A faded scarf that still smelled faintly of lavender. Her father's leather gloves, stiff with time. Her hands trembled as she picked up a photo, the last one ever taken of them. Her parents in front of the house, arms around each other, eyes squinting in the light, laughing at something she couldn't remember anymore. Jake's footsteps on the stairs were quiet, but she knew them instantly. He didn't speak at first, just stood in the doorway, watching her from the shadows like he wasn't sure if he should come closer. "I told them not to go," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "The night of the crash. We were fighting about everything, selling the land, the future, stupid stuff that felt big back then. I slammed the door, said I didn't care if I ever saw them again." Jake stepped forward slowly. "Sarah, I meant it," she said, cutting him off, her eyes locked on the photograph. "I was angry, and selfish, and I meant it. Then they got in the car, and they never came back. Her voice cracked, the grief she'd buried for a decade, rising up like a tide she couldn't outrun. Jake knelt beside her, not touching, not crowding, just there. "You didn't cause that crash," he said softly. "You didn't push their tires off the road. You were a teenager, hurt, human." "But I told them I hated them," she whispered, "and it was the last thing I ever said." Jake reached out, gently pulling the photo from her fingers, setting it down with care. Then he took her hand. "They knew," he said, "even through all that anger, they knew you loved them. That's what parents do. They see past the noise." Sarah broke then, not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet unraveling of someone who'd been carrying shame for far too long. And Jake, steady as always, held her hand and let it happen, until there was nothing left to do but breathe. The days that followed moved with a different kind of rhythm, not rushed, not easy, just steady. The kind of pace that came when you stopped running and started rebuilding. Jake showed up at sunrise with a truck bed full of lumber and coffee so strong it made Sarah wince. He worked without complaint, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat soaking through his shirt before the morning fog had lifted. Sarah matched him, hammer for hammer, her hands blistered by noon, but her eyes clearer than they'd been in years. Lily was everywhere, helping where she could, singing under her breath while she painted the chicken coop a blinding shade of blue. She named the hens after comic book characters and gave the barn cat a bed made out of an old tackle box. Her laughter was constant, spilling across the property like sunlight, chasing away whatever shadows lingered in the corners. The porch steps were the first to go, rotted through and sagging with age. Jake rebuilt them one board at a time, Lily holding the level with exaggerated seriousness. Sarah stood back for a moment, watching them laugh over a crooked nail, and something in her chest cracked open in a way that didn't hurt anymore. Neighbors started showing up, first out of curiosity, then out of habit. Martha from the diner brought peach cobbler and enough gossip to fill the whole afternoon. Old man Jensen loaned them a post-hole digger and stayed long enough to drink 3 cups of Sarah's coffee, grumbling about the weather the entire time. The town hadn't forgotten her after all. It had just been waiting for her to come home and stop pretending she wasn't. They fixed the barn roof next, Jake and Sarah side by side on the scaffolding, arguing about angles while Lily shouted instructions from below. The sun burned them raw, and the hammering echoed across the field, but when it was done, Sarah stood back and looked at it like it had always belonged. Fences were mended, weeds pulled, soil turned over by hand and sweat and hope. They weren't just restoring a house or patching a fence line. They were building something new, something honest, something that could last. The soil was dark and rich under Sarah's fingers, the way it used to be when her father taught her how to plant by feel, not by instruction. She dug a row with the heel of her boot and dropped the seeds one by one, each movement slow, deliberate, sacred. Lily knelt beside her, covered in dirt, cheeks flushed, grinning like she was planting a secret. Jake was at the edge of the field, tightening the last slat of the new fence, his back to the setting sun. When he stood, stretching the ache from his shoulders, he looked out at the land and saw something that hadn't been there in a long time. Life. It had started with small things, a coat of paint, repaired gutters, a mailbox that didn't hang sideways. But now, with rows of sprouting green, the Sinclair ranch didn't just look alive. It felt it. The silence that once haunted it had shifted into something else, anticipation, promise. That night, Sarah walked into the barn and flipped the breaker. For a moment, nothing. Then the lights above the rafters flickered once, twice, and caught. One by one, the bulbs warmed and bloomed, casting golden light across the hayloft and the new plywood stalls. Jake leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her face. She turned, smiling, the glow catching the edges of her eyes. "It's strange," she said, almost laughing. "I thought this place would always belong to the past." "It doesn't," Jake replied. "Not anymore." Outside, the porch lights were on. The roof didn't leak. The fence didn't sag. A new welcome mat sat in front of the door, a gift from Lily that said simply, "You belong here." The Sinclair ranch was no longer a monument to loss. It was a home. Neighbors came and went, bringing seedlings, advice, borrowed tools. Children ran through the grass, boots kicking up dust. Laughter filled the air like it had never left. Sarah stood on the porch that evening, her arm brushing against Jake's, Lily leaning on her other side. And for the first time in a decade, she didn't feel like she was trespassing on her own land. She felt rooted. And it was enough. Jake leaned against the fence post, the one he and Sarah had reset 2 weeks back when the old cedar gave way in the wind. It was solid now, anchored deep, like something meant to stay. He rested one hand on the top rail and watched the scene unfolding in the field below, Lily chasing after a runaway hat, squealing with laughter, and Sarah just behind her, breathless from laughing too hard, hair caught in the breeze, cheeks red from sun and joy. He didn't call out to them, didn't move. Just stood there, the hammer still hooked to his belt, fingers stained with soil and paint and time. And for the first time and longer than he could remember, he wasn't thinking about bills or repairs or how to stretch one more day out of an empty tank. He wasn't fixing anything. He was watching something whole. Sarah fell into the grass beside Lily, both of them breathless, their laughter folding into the hush of the land. The sky above them was streaked with orange and soft pink, the sun sinking slow behind the tree line, casting long shadows and golden light that made everything look like memory. Jake's chest tightened, not with fear, not with loneliness, but with something quieter, something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time, peace. He had spent so many years being the man who fixed things, the guy who kept it together when everything else was falling apart, the mechanic, the dad, the one who stayed behind when others left. But now, as he watched Sarah run her hand through Lily's hair and Lily lean into her like it was the most natural thing in the world, Jake realized something else. He wasn't just the man who fixed engines anymore. He was part of something. This land, this house, this family, whatever shape it was becoming. He wasn't alone. He hadn't been for a while now. He just hadn't let himself believe it until now. Jake looked up at the sky one last time before turning toward the house, the porch light already flicked on, casting its warm, steady glow. And for once he didn't feel like he was walking towards something temporary. He felt like he was finally coming home. The sign went up just after sunrise, the kind of morning that carried a stillness too pure to touch. Dew clung to the grass in silvery threads, and the wind held its breath as Jake and Sarah stood side by side, watching the final bolts tighten under the weight of new beginnings. The wood was reclaimed from the old barn doors, weathered, scarred, but strong. Sarah had painted the letters herself, slow and steady strokes laid into the night when the world was quiet and her hands knew what they were doing better than her heart did. Jake had mounted the post holes with care, measuring twice, digging deeper than he had to, like it mattered that this lasted. It did. The sign read, Sinclair and Carter Ranch. No frills, no embellishment. Just two names, carved into a future neither of them had planned for, but both had decided to choose. Word had gotten out, as it always did in towns like theirs. So when the last bolt went in and the sign stood tall under the soft glare of the morning sun, folks began to show. Martha brought cinnamon rolls, claiming she was just passing through. The Jensen boys leaned on their truck, arms crossed, nodding like they'd had something to do with it. Even Sheriff Dalton stopped by, tipping his hat with a quiet kind of respect that meant more than words. No one asked questions. Not now. The whispers had turned to something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. Or pride. Sarah stood still, one hand on Lily's shoulder, the other brushing the back of Jake's arm. She didn't speak, but her eyes were glossy, wide, not with fear, not anymore. Just the weight of knowing she'd finally stopped running. And parked out front, just beneath the sign, sat the old green truck. Same cracked leather seats, same faded paint. But it wasn't broken anymore. It stood like a marker in time, weathered, proud, and very much alive. People would drive past now and see more than a ranch. They'd see a story of loss, of return, of rebuilding what matters. Jake looked at Sarah, then at Lily, then at the sign. It didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like the first real chapter. And this time, none of them were alone.